The night I opened the community newsletter and saw my violation paraded for everyone to read, I realized a simple rain barrel had turned into a public trial. The email subject bragged about protecting property values, but buried in the second paragraph was a smug little line about a homeowner being fined $750 for illegal water storage. Everyone in our townhome court knew that meant me, even though my name never appeared. It was the kind of petty move that told me this wasn't just about rules, it was about power. Outside my window, the shared courtyard sat under a low, cloudy sky, the last drizzle of an early summer storm still dripping from gutters like a slow ticking clock. That faint patter against metal was the sound I had wanted to catch and reuse, not waste. I had set up those rain barrels to be practical and responsible, not to start a campaign against the board. But when that citation leaked into the newsletter overnight, the stakes changed. The money hurt, of course. $750 is not pocket change, especially in a community where the association fees already bite a chunk out of every month. Still, it was the humiliation that hit deeper. Strangers could now speculate about what I had done wrong, neighbors could whisper about the rule breaker on the corner. A private notice had been turned into a public warning, like I was the poster child for what happens if you dare to step out of line. I stared at the screen and scrolled back up, reading the words again and again. It wasn't just a reminder about rules, it was a quiet threat aimed at everyone who might even think about testing the limits. The board was using me as an example. That was when the anger settled into something colder and more focused. If they wanted to turn me into a lesson for the community, they didn't realize I had lessons of my own lined up for them. I didn't slam my laptop or start firing off messages. I did something that always scares people who abuse their authority. I got quiet. I took a breath, listened to the muted hum of cars on the main road beyond our walls, and started mentally retracing every step from the day I first mentioned rain barrels to the property manager. Somewhere in that trail, I knew there were receipts. And as much as this whole thing felt like an HOA nightmare, I was about to turn it into something else entirely. To understand how we got there, you have to picture the layout of our community. It wasn't some massive sprawling suburb with big yards and wide streets. It was a compact, tightly packed townhome complex, built around a shared inner court where the mail kiosks, guest parking, and a thin strip of grass all squeezed together. On weekend mornings, you could smell laundry detergent drifting out of dryer vents as everyone tried to get chores done before the day heated up. Every unit had a small patio or narrow fenced area in the back, barely enough space for a grill and a couple of chairs. There were no big lawns to show off, no grand driveways. That should have made everything simpler, but it had the opposite effect. Because the space was small, the association obsessed over every inch. The color of doormats, the kind of string lights you could hang, even how many potted plants you were allowed next to your gate, all carefully spelled out in the CC and RS like they were protecting a museum instead of a lived-in neighborhood. Our board president, who I'll call Ms. D, treated those documents like sacred text. She had a way of inserting references to sections and subsections into casual announcements, as if she kept the whole thing memorized. The treasurer, Mr. K, mostly hovered in the background, nodding along like an echo. Then there was the property manager on contract, always signing emails with a cheerful closing that somehow made the content feel more condescending. They didn't see themselves as neighbors, they acted like security staff guarding a fragile image. For a long time, I tried to be the perfect rule follower. I read the handbook. I kept my trash bins behind the tiny fence between collection days. I even measured the height of my planters once to make sure they weren't poking above the railing. Still, the water bills kept creeping higher each summer, and the storms kept getting more erratic. Every time we got one of those sudden, drenching downpours, I watched sheets of water pour off the downspouts and vanish into the storm drains. It felt wasteful. A couple of years back, I had reached out to the property manager about adding low-profile rain collection planters. I still remember the date because I filed the email away, April 9, 2022. The message came back with a simple written confirmation that my planters, as described, were approved so long as they did not exceed the fence line or alter the overall exterior appearance. I saved that email in a folder called HOA, just in case I ever needed it. The thing is, state laws had been shifting too. There were new homeowner-friendly rules about collecting rainwater, especially in areas where drought and water restrictions were becoming a regular part of life. I had skimmed a state resource page that mentioned small, closed rain barrels as protected installations in common interest developments. I wasn't a legal expert, but I understood enough to know that associations couldn't just ban everything they didn't like anymore, not if it met the guidelines. So by the time I finally bought my first rain barrel, I thought I was walking a careful line. I chose a small, beige barrel that matched the stucco. I tucked it behind a planter, where it barely peeked above the edge of the fence. From the inside, I could hear the faint gurgle when it caught runoff, but from the shared walkways, it was almost invisible. For months, not a single notice appeared on my door, not a single email pinged my inbox. I told myself that meant I had done everything by the book. The property manager had already approved the concept. The barrel matched the exterior. The state guidelines backed me up. If anyone from the board had a problem, they could have reached out quietly and asked questions. Instead, they waited until they had something juicier, a way to turn a quiet, responsible choice into a public spectacle. The moment that newsletter went out, it was clear they weren't interested in a conversation. They wanted control. If there was one person in the community who loved control more than the board, it was the neighbor I think of as the Snitch. She lived in the unit diagonally across the court, with a second-story balcony that had the perfect angle to look down into several patios. I'll call her Lynn. She wasn't on the board, but she acted like an unpaid enforcement officer, always out at just the right time to notice something. I first realized how closely she watched everything on a random Tuesday, months before the rain barrel drama exploded. I stepped outside to move a package just inside my gate, and there she was, leaning on her balcony rail, eyes flicking from my doorstep to the parking spaces. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. She had this habit of lingering and then disappearing right after you adjusted whatever she seemed to be watching. It was like having a human security camera with opinions. At first, it was small stuff. A neighbor's guest car parked slightly over a faded line would move after an email from the manager about parking compliance. A wreath that had been hanging on a door for a few weeks vanished, suspiciously soon after a general reminder that only seasonal decor was allowed and must be removed within 30 days. No names were ever listed, but you could feel the pattern. Lynn noticed. Lynn reported. The board issued a blanket email. Everyone knew who it was really about. When I set up the second rain barrel, I felt her watching again. The day was heavy with heat, and the air buzzed with the low, constant whir of air conditioners cycling on across the complex. I adjusted the barrel so that it lined up neatly with the fence, noting how its muted color blended with the wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shape shift on the balcony. Lynn was there for a moment, then gone. I told myself it was nothing, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. A week later, the first notice arrived. It popped up in my inbox at exactly 6:02 a.m., time-stamped like the board wanted to prove how efficient they were. The subject line referenced an unauthorized exterior installation, and the body of the email outlined a violation, unapproved rainwater storage visible from the common area. It listed a fine of $250, with language about ongoing noncompliance leading to additional penalties. At the bottom, there was an attached PDF labeled Final Notice, Water Storage, dated June 20, 2024, even though it was the first time anyone had said anything. That document was more than just a threat, it was my second piece of evidence. The wording was careless. It claimed I had never sought permission for any form of rainwater collection, which I knew was wrong because of my April 2022 approval email. It also suggested that all such devices were strictly prohibited by the governing documents, a statement I had never seen before. I didn't argue, not yet. I downloaded the PDF and dropped it into my HOA folder right beside the old approval email. If the private notice had stayed private, the story might have ended there with tense emails and a quiet compromise. But the next day, the community newsletter went out. Right underneath a cheerful blurb about summer safety tips, the board had slipped in a segment about illegal rain capture devices, complete with a warning that one homeowner had already been cited a total of $750 and could face a lien for continued noncompliance. It mentioned the exact corner of the court where my unit was located. They might as well have printed my street number. That was the moment when this stopped feeling like a simple case of over-enforcement and started feeling like an attack. I could picture the chain of events: Lynn noticing the barrels, snapping photos, sending them to the board with a self-righteous message about community standards. The board, instead of checking their own records or the law, turning it into a performance. They were using my situation to scare everyone else into staying small and quiet. What they didn't realize was that by broadcasting my supposed violation, they handed me the perfect reason to dig deeper into their own obligations. If they could threaten me with a lien over a rain barrel, what would happen when I walked into their July 3 meeting with state water law printed out, their old approval email highlighted, and their own final notice contradicted in front of everyone? That night, I stayed up late, lit only by the glow of my laptop screen while the rest of the court settled into silence. The courtyard lights cast soft yellow pools on the pavement, leaving the spaces between shadows deep and empty. I opened my HOA folder and laid the digital trail side by side: the April 9, 2022 approval email, the June 20, 2024 final notice, and the newsletter screenshot with the $750 figure circled in red. The inconsistencies jumped out like they had been waiting for me to notice. I pulled up the state's official page on residential rainwater harvesting, scanning line after line until I found the section I remembered. There it was, a clear statement that common interest communities could not unreasonably restrict small, closed rain barrels that met safety and placement guidelines. It didn't say associations had no say at all, but it did say they couldn't outright ban compliant installations. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the room temperature. The board hadn't just been petty, they might have been out of step with the law. I took screenshots of the page, making sure the URL and date were visible. Each image went into the same folder, lined up with the other receipts. This wasn't just about my $750 anymore. It was about the pattern, about the way the board and the snitch worked together to keep everyone scared and obedient. If they were going to use me as an example of what happens when you cross them, I was going to turn the spotlight back around. In that quiet moment, with the faint hum of my refrigerator and the far-off whoosh of a passing car breaking the stillness, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg for mercy or write a panicked apology. I was going to prepare. I marked the date of the next open board meeting on my calendar, July 3, 2024. Then I started a new document simply titled Timeline. I wrote down every key date, every notice, every approval, every amount. The association wanted to play a long game of intimidation. I was getting ready for something very different. This wasn't just another bit of homeowners association drama that would blow over in a week. It was the beginning of a slow, careful pushback, one where every screenshot and every dated email mattered. They had turned my rain barrels into a spectacle, but they had no idea how many eyes would be on them once I was done gathering my proof. The days after I built that timeline felt like standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite see yet. Every time I walked through the court, I felt the weight of that newsletter on my back like a sign I couldn't take off. I'd catch glimpses of neighbors glancing up from their phones as I passed, their faces smoothing out just a little too fast. No one said anything outright, but the silence around me had a new shape. I went back into the governing documents, this time with a highlighter and the patience of someone who has already been publicly embarrassed and refuses to let it happen twice. The section on exterior modifications was dense, but after rereading it more than once, something became very clear: there was no outright ban on rainwater collection containers. There was vague language about visible devices, needing screening and conformity, but nothing like the sweeping claims in my violation notice. That gap between what the documents actually said and what the board claimed they said became another line in my timeline. I added a note: CCRs silent on total ban, references to screening and appearance only. Then I bookmarked the exact paragraph numbers. If they wanted to act like I was ignoring the rules, I wanted it written down that they were the ones twisting them. One afternoon, I went to the mail kiosk to pick up a package, and there it was, a printed version of the same community newsletter that had gone out by email. The heat had turned the metal mailboxes warm under my fingers, and the air smelled faintly like sun-baked asphalt and dryer sheets. I flipped through the stapled pages right there and saw the section about illegal water storage again, this time in bold, sitting between a recipe for summer punch and a feel-good blurb about neighborliness. It was surreal, standing there under the buzzing fluorescent light while my supposed offense was packaged as a lesson for everyone else. I could feel eyes on me from somewhere above, and when I glanced up, I spotted movement on Lynn's balcony. She was out for just a moment, leaning on the rail, looking down at the court like it belonged to her. Then she disappeared into her unit as if the timing were a coincidence. I held the newsletter in my hand longer than I needed to, as if weighing it. That printed paragraph wasn't just an embarrassment, it was an admission. The board had taken a specific situation and turned it into a public example, using me as proof that they were protecting the community. They never imagined that I'd tuck that newsletter into a folder next to their contradictory notices and state law screenshots. The next email from the property manager arrived before I even had time to process that moment. This one didn't pretend to be calm. It referenced the prior, final notice, and claimed that because I had failed to remove the unapproved devices by the compliance date, the fines had accrued to a total of $750. It included a firm line about forwarding my account to pre-lien review if the balance wasn't paid before July 1st. I read that message more than once, then added the date and wording to my timeline. I wasn't just dealing with a single citation anymore. The board was setting up a clock, a countdown to something more serious. They wanted me to panic, pay, and quietly haul the barrels away before anyone questioned them. Instead, every threat they sent turned into another entry in the file I was building. The pressure in the complex shifted. That newsletter, combined with the talk of liens, did exactly what it was designed to do. People began to move differently. Decorative items vanished from patios. A couple of small planter boxes near the far units were suddenly gone. The once lively string lights over a neighbor's tiny sitting area went dark and disappeared. The message was clear: if they could go after a rain barrel, they could go after anything. A few days later, an envelope arrived in my regular mail. No cute email sign-off this time. Just a stark, official-looking letterhead at the top of a single-page notice stamped, pre-lien warning. It claimed I owed $750 in accumulated fines and administrative fees for non-compliance. It referenced a section of the governing documents I hadn't paid attention to before, a clause I'll call CCR Section 4.3, the so-called mailbox rule, which stated that notices were considered delivered once sent to the address on file. They were using that clause to justify moving fast, as if a handful of rushed emails and one mailed letter were enough to push me toward a recorded lien that could cloud my title. The letter gave me a firm deadline: pay by July 1st or face referral to the association's legal counsel for further action. I could picture the next step: fees layered onto fees until the original issue disappeared under a pile of costs. I set the letter down on my kitchen table, where the afternoon light made the printed black text look even harsher against the white page. Then I took a deep breath and did something the board wasn't expecting. I didn't crumble. I didn't promise to pay. I didn't yank the barrels out in a panic. I opened my browser again. I went back to the state's homeowner resources, this time reading past the general summary. I found language explaining that in my state, fines and certain types of penalties did not automatically carry the same lien rights as unpaid assessments or dues. The law was clear enough that even someone like me, with no legal training, could follow the basic point. The board could threaten all they wanted, but they couldn't simply transform every penalty into something that followed my property forever. That realization didn't turn me into a lawyer, and it didn't mean the situation was harmless. It did something else. It shifted the fear. The board had been using the idea of a lien as a weapon, assuming no one would look behind the curtain. Now I knew that if they pushed forward anyway, they wouldn't just be punishing me, they'd be walking themselves closer to a line they probably shouldn't cross. I scanned that pre-lien warning, making sure the date and language were clear in the image, and saved it to my folder with a file name I wouldn't forget: pre-lien warning, June 27, 2024. It became another piece of the puzzle, sitting between the final notice PDF and the state law screenshots. Every time I opened that folder, the pattern shouted a little louder. If they were willing to threaten a lien over one compliant rain barrel and a newsletter headline, what would happen when I carried those mismatched dates, exaggerated claims, and state law printouts into a crowded meeting room and read them into the record, line by line, while the very neighbors they scared sat listening? The social ripple inside the community was hard to ignore. A neighbor from 2 doors down stopped me near the mailboxes and, in a low, uneasy tone, mentioned that the board seemed extra intense lately. Another sent a short message through the community portal, saying they had removed a couple of decorative items after seeing my situation in the newsletter. They didn't want to be next. I could tell the tactic was working on some people. It was turning our shared court into a place where everyone was scared to breathe wrong. The irony was that, as the target of their little campaign, I actually felt more focused than afraid. I had something to hold on to now, a timeline, evidence, and a date where all of this could be laid out, not in whispers, but in front of the people who were supposed to represent us. That date sat on my calendar like a loaded marker, July 3, 2024, the open board meeting. A few days before that meeting, another document appeared, this time posted in the portal and taped to the bulletin board near the mail kiosks. It was the board meeting agenda for July 3. Under the list of items, right after routine things like approval of minutes and financial report, there sat a line that made my stomach flip: old business, water storage policy and compliance. There it was, in plain text. I wasn't mentioned by name, but the subject might as well have had my unit number attached. That agenda became my next evidence prop. I snapped a photo of the printed copy on the bulletin board, the paper slightly curled at the corners where humid air from the summer afternoon had softened it. Then I downloaded the digital version from the portal and filed it away with the rest. Now it was official. The board had made my rain barrels an agenda item, not just for me to worry about, but for any homeowner who cared enough to attend. I kept my preparation grounded and methodical. I printed out the April 9, 2022 email approving my low-profile rain collection planters, highlighting the line confirming the approval. I printed the final notice, water storage, dated June 20, 2024, with its claim that I had never sought permission, and highlighted that sentence too. I printed the pre-lien warning with its reliance on CCR Section 4.3 and its threat of referral to council. Then I laid the state law screenshots side by side, highlighting the sections about rain barrels in common interest communities and reasonable restrictions. Looking at everything together, it struck me how exaggerated the whole situation had grown. This was supposed to be about a small device catching stormwater. Instead, it had turned into a textbook example of HOA fines gone wrong, overblown into a spectacle. The board had stacked newsletters, notices, and warnings on top of each other, trying to make a simple, lawful choice look reckless. By that point, my file held everything: the original approval email, the rushed final notice, the pre-lien warning, the state law screenshots, and now the agenda that turned my rain barrels into a formal topic. The board had used my case to scare the community. I was getting ready to use their own paper trail to show everyone how far they had pushed it. Once I had the documents printed and highlighted, I created one more item, a single, neat sheet titled Timeline, Rainwater Collection and Board Actions. On it, I listed dates and events: April 9, 2022, approval granted. Installation of first barrel. Installation of second barrel. June 20, 2024, final notice, claiming no prior approval. Newsletter publication referencing illegal water storage and $750 total fines. Pre-lien warning dated June 27. July 3 board meeting with water storage policy and compliance on the agenda. I printed several copies of that timeline. One for myself. One for the board table. And a few extras, just in case any homeowner who came to the meeting wanted to see for themselves how quickly a quiet, responsible decision had been turned into an overblown enforcement saga. The more I worked, the more my anger cooled into something sharper. This wasn't just about me winning a fight. It was about pulling back the curtain on how the association had been operating, especially when it came to enforcement driven by people like Lynn, who seemed to enjoy watching others get called out. If I walked into that meeting prepared, the board's usual tactics, vague references, hurried warnings, and selective citations, wouldn't land the same way. The shift from defense to offense started small but felt huge inside my own head. I bought a slim binder and some cheap-colored tabs from a nearby office supply aisle. At my dining table, with the ceiling fan turning lazy circles above me and the faint sound of distant traffic drifting through the window, I organized everything. Tab 1, Approvals. Behind it, the printed April 9, 2022 email and a screenshot of the message as it appeared in my inbox, showing the date stamp and the property manager's name. Tab 2, Board Notices. The final notice, water storage, the newsletter printout with my violation circled in pen, and the pre-lien warning, each with their contradictions highlighted. Tab 3, Governing Documents. The sections from the CC and RS talking about exterior changes and CCR section 4.3, with careful underlining where the board's story veered away from what the documents actually said. Tab 4, State Law. The rainwater harvesting page and the residential common interest community section, printed clearly with the date I accessed them visible. At the back, I slipped in the July 3rd agenda and my one-page timeline. Looking at that binder, I realized I wasn't just assembling papers. I was building a narrative that didn't depend on drama or gossip. It depended on facts, dates, and their own words. I wrote out what I wanted to say during the open forum portion of the meeting. No shouting, no theatrics. Just a structured walkthrough of the timeline, a reminder of my prior approval, a calm summary of how the board's notices and threats conflicted with both the CC and RS and the state's guidance on rainwater collection. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone for the sake of it, I wanted to trap their behavior in the light where everyone could see it. As July 3rd approached, the air around the complex shifted again. Humidity wrapped around everything in a thick, warm layer, and the sky held that hazy brightness that hinted at upcoming fireworks. A few kids passed through the court with sparklers still in their packaging, talking excitedly about the holiday weekend. Somewhere in the distance, early practice pops of fireworks crackled like distant thunder. I noticed that Lynn was spending more time on her balcony again. She seemed to track comings and goings with even more focus than before, like she was waiting to see if her report would produce visible consequences. If she suspected that I was the one getting ready to push back, she didn't show it. Or maybe she assumed the outcome was already decided. After all, how many homeowners ever walked into a meeting with a binder full of receipts? By the night before the meeting, my plan was simple: walk into that clubhouse with my binder, put my timeline and copies on the board's table, and speak so clearly that the association's usual tricks couldn't hide behind vague phrases anymore. They thought they were calling me in to be an example of what happens when you disobey. They were about to learn what happens when a homeowner refuses to be quietly shamed. On the day of the meeting, the late afternoon light slanted across the court, painting long shadows from the parked cars and the clipped shrubs along the walkway. The community room was just off the main driveway, its windows slightly fogged by the competing chill of the air conditioning inside. As I walked toward it with my binder tucked under my arm, I could feel my pulse in my hands, but not from fear alone. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when the wind holds its breath. Outside the entrance, a small sign announced the meeting time and reminded residents that open forum would be limited to a few minutes per person. I signed my name on the attendance sheet on the little folding table inside, my pen making a faint scratch against the paper, and scanned the room. Board members clustered at the front, shuffling papers and adjusting nameplates. A handful of homeowners sat spaced across the chairs, some scrolling their phones, others chatting quietly. Near the back, in a chair that gave her a clear view of both the board and the audience, sat Lynn. She had a slim folder in her lap, one leg crossed over the other, her expression carefully neutral. For a second, our eyes met. She looked away first. I took a seat where I could see everything: the board, the other owners, the stack of agendas on a side table. The hum of the air conditioning filled the room with a steady, low sound. I placed my binder on my lap, the tabs peeking out like small, colored flags. The board thought this was their stage. They thought they'd already written the script. As I sat there waiting for the meeting to start, I realized something important: I wasn't the one being summoned anymore. I was the one bringing the story, and this time, they were the ones who would have to answer to it. The start of the meeting felt strangely ordinary for something that had my entire week coiled up around it. The board ran through the usual motions: roll call, approving the prior minutes, a quick overview of the budget. Paper shuffled. Pens clicked. The air conditioning hummed steady from the ceiling vents, cooling a room full of people who had no idea the association's carefully curated image was about to be challenged by a binder and a timeline. I stepped out into the warm night, where the air smelled faintly of grass and distant barbecue smoke. Overhead, the sky was a dark, velvety blue, with a few early fireworks cracking somewhere beyond the complex. For the first time in weeks, walking across the court didn't feel like walking under a spotlight aimed at me alone. The board still had to respond, but the story wasn't theirs anymore. The answer came faster than I expected. A few days after the meeting, a new email landed in everyone's inbox. The subject line called it a policy clarification and correction. The body explained that, upon further review, certain references to illegal water storage devices in prior communications had been overly broad. It stated that small, closed rain barrels that met specific placement and screening guidelines would be permitted in the community, consistent with state law. Then, in carefully composed language, it noted that a particular homeowner's fines related to rainwater collection had been reassessed, and that any associated charges and pre-lien warnings had been rescinded. No unit number mentioned this time, no corner of the court pointed out. But everyone who had read the earlier newsletter knew exactly who it was about. They had to walk it back. They had to put in writing that they had gone too far. A revised newsletter followed soon after, tucked between updates on community events and reminders about trash bins. There, in a small but visible section, the board acknowledged that prior messaging about water storage had caused unnecessary concern and that updated guidelines, outlined in a new water collection addendum, would govern future installations. They used smooth language, but the meaning was clear. They had been pushed into transparency. The pre-lien warning never turned into anything more. No lien was recorded. No legal counsel stepped in. Instead, my account balance returned to normal, as if the $750 had been a bad dream someone decided to erase. The punishment they had planned for me never arrived, but something else did, a quiet shift in power. The board realized they couldn't count on fear alone anymore. And the snitch who had triggered it all had to live with a community that now knew how far her reports could go, and how far they had been taken. In the weeks that followed, people began to behave differently. Not recklessly, no one turned their patios into wild displays or stopped respecting shared spaces, but with a new kind of awareness. Homeowners asked more questions at meetings. They requested copies of policies instead of taking vague warnings at face value. When a new reminder email went out, more than one person would cross-check it against the CC and RS and, sometimes, against state guidance. As for my rain barrels, they stayed. I made a few tweaks in line with the new guidelines, double-checked the screening, ensured the lids were secured, and kept them tucked neatly behind the fence line. Now, when the sky darkened and the first drops began to fall, the gentle tapping of water into those barrels sounded less like something contraband and more like a quiet victory. The social aftermath was more subtle, but it was there. Lynn didn't spend quite as much time on her balcony after all of this. When she did appear, her posture no longer carried the same effortless authority. Word drifted through the grapevine that a few neighbors had stopped engaging with her the same way, no longer eager to trade casual complaints in exchange for her watchful help. Without open hostility, the court simply became less interested in feeding that particular kind of attention. At the next annual meeting, a few months down the line, something else happened. A new candidate ran for the board with a platform focused on transparency, communication, and respect for both community standards and individual rights. Enough people had seen what happened over that summer to vote for a change. The election results shifted the balance. The president's role changed. The association didn't transform overnight into a perfect council of reason, but it became more cautious about how it used its power. I looked back on the chain of events and realized this had been more than just one story about one homeowner. It was a reminder that even in small, tightly controlled spaces, abuse of power rarely stays invisible forever. All it takes is one person willing to gather receipts, lay out dates, and speak into a microphone that was meant to be pointed only one way. Long after the dust settled, I would still get a small, private satisfaction every time a storm rolled in. The sky would darken over the townhome roofs, thunder rumbling softly in the distance, and rain would start its steady tap against gutters and railings. The barrels would fill, quiet and steady, no longer symbols of rebellion but proof that common sense and persistence could carve out space even in the most regulated corners of life. I did not become the person who challenged every minor rule or turned every small misunderstanding into a crusade. I picked my battles. But once you see how quickly power can twist something simple into something threatening, you never look at silence the same way again. You learn to recognize when you're being asked to accept humiliation as the price of peace. In the end, I wasn't the villain the newsletter wanted me to be. I wasn't the cautionary tale. I became something else instead, the reminder that homeowners aren't props in the board story. We are part of it, and sometimes, we get to rewrite the ending. Tell me your rain barrel HOA horror in one single line.